Hello and welcome to episode 20 of Ghost Creatures and Scares Oh My. This episode is called Bloodthirsty Vampires, the American edition.
In this podcast, we take the entity featured in each episode of the popular show Supernatural and we explore creepy real life stories, myths, and legend that surround the theme.
This week, we're looking at episode 20 of season 1 of Supernatural called Dead Man's Blood. After Daniel Elkins, a vampire hunter and John's mentor, is murdered, Sam and Dean are surprised when John himself shows up to solve the case. John discovers the vampires have taken an antique gun which has the power to kill all supernatural beings. The Winchester family sets out to retrieve the gun from the vampires so that they can use it to kill the demon that took Sam and Dean's mother.
So it's been a quite a nice week, hasn't it?
It has, yeah.
We're recording this a little bit in advance because we've got a busy week coming up next week. So when we're recording this, episode 19's just gone out last Friday. So that was the episode Haunted Paintings where we looked at the crying boy and the polar bear painting, and
Yeah.
a lot of people enjoyed that one. I found it like got a lot of good feedback from that one. So I think people kind of enjoy the urban legend side of things as well. Um, and I've got into a new podcast as well that I was telling you about. So I've really enjoyed listening to Uncanny. It's by Danny Robbins. So you know the show that I went to see at the theatre a couple of
Yeah.
weeks ago, 222. It was really good, really enjoyed it. So he does a podcast and it's actually just been released. They've made like a TV show. So I really enjoyed watching that. And speaking of TV and films, we're having a bit of a Halloween crisis, aren't we? In
Yeah,
terms of
we've got
not
a
getting through what we
massive,
want to.
massive build-up of films and TV shows that we're trying to get through, haven't we?
So every year, like we've mentioned before, Halloween's a biggie in our house, and October seems to go on for a long time because we're packed full of things like going out places and well, I'm kind of lying there. We're kind of just packed full of like watching
Lots of
watching
film
films
days.
and TV
Yeah.
shows, but it's just been so busy. Like last year, our little girl was like really little, so we could probably put her to bed a bit earlier and to an extent should nap a lot during the day so we could maybe if we weren't working would watch something, but this is October is getting away from us
Yeah,
is how it
it's flying
feels.
by. It's not good.
So we do need to kind of knuckle down and get into some more of our kind of scary things. And speaking of which, last thing I'll say before we move on is we are going to be recording a Halloween special, which I'm really excited about. But anyway, we're looking at vampires today. So this week's theme is a biggie, and it's a bit like witches. The concept of vampirism goes hand in hand with the genre even of horror itself, and Dracula is perhaps the most famous monster of them all. Today, we'll dive into the folklore and the origin of the blood drinking demon and hear about a vampire who terrorized the east coast of America in the 19th century, as well as the eerie legend of black eyed kids roaming the night for unsuspecting victims. So the whole idea of this episode is there is another vampire episode, isn't there, in season 2 of Supernatural?
There is, yeah.
So what we've decided to do is break it into two kind of parts. So the next part won't come until the new year because it's a few episodes away into season 2 of Supernatural. So this one is going to be all about stories I've found about vampires based in America, and the next one's going to be a British version.
Yeah.
So, firstly, before we can dive into these stories and a bit of the history and the folklore, I couldn't start it without us briefly exploring the concept of vampires in popular culture. So, very much like we did last week, sometimes you can't really do that for some of them. But like witches, sorry, not last week, the week before, vampires is so entrenched in horror films and series and fantasy. So who's your favorite vampire or your favorite vampire film or franchise?
Oh, so I'm going to pick Blade just because I love Marvel.
Hmm.
If I was to pick my favorite vampires that I think based off a film, it'd probably be the one from Van Helsing with Dracula because I think that's how vampires should be done.
Yeah.
Like the way that they chose to go, even with the werewolves in that one, the way that they chose to
Hmm.
go down this sort of art style, it was perfect.
Well, I didn't. I've written down for you what I thought you were going to say. I didn't even think about Blade. I didn't know Blade was a is that Blade Runner?
No,
Oh,
Blade, Blade with Wesley Snipes.
oh, I don't know.
Like the vampire films, he fights Dracula and that. He's like Daywalker.
Oh, I don't. I'll be honest. I
He's
haven't
like
been
a
into
half.
that.
He's like a half vampire. It's
How
Marvel
maybe a half vampire?
because his mom was like bit sort of as she was in labour with him. So
Hmm.
like he was born and he sort of took on like sort of half.
So
It's
how's he a
great.
half
So
vampire? So he
because
can
he
walk
can
around in the
walk
sun.
in the sun,
Yeah,
he
and
can walk in the
yeah,
sun. He still has their hunger, and he's got a longer life.
but he's not
And he's
immortal.
super like strength and fast and stuff. But
Yeah,
he doesn't have as long a life as
yeah.
normal vampires. But he's pretty much got all of the strengths just
So he's
about,
like a demigod in
and
the
not very many of the weaknesses except for needing blood.
ah. I'll be honest, I haven't seen that. But I did write down Van Helsing for you, and I've also written down Underworld because don't you like
I do
Underworld?
love an world,
Is that
yeah.
vampires as
That's
well?
vampires and
Yeah,
werewolves,
yeah, I
yeah.
thought so. Uh-huh. For me, I've written down, I've written this down, and it's not Twilight, but you know what? I like Twilight. I'm gonna put it out there. I know everyone will be rolling their eyes. It gets so much hate. I know it's like garbage, but I really like it. And for me though, it's got to be probably The Lost Boys or Interview with a Vampire. They're the ones that spring out to me.
Yeah, fair enough.
I love Hotel Transylvania. I've written down because I do enjoy that.
Fantastic.
But no, I love for Lost Boys. Kiefer Sutherland is the 80s vampire, like bullying everyone in town. It's
No,
like Stranger Things vibes, isn't it?
there's sort of different types of vampire movies.
There's so many
I
different
prefer the
types.
action types,
Yeah, that's action, I would have said. It's a bit more like
not as.
there's lots of action in Twilight.
Yeah.
Um, but for me, TV show wise, can sometimes be better, and I would say True Blood is
True Blood's really good.
really good. I'm not into the originals of Vampire Diaries
I
like
like them.
you.
I love them as well. Yeah.
See, I'm not into that. I love True.
think I
Oh,
prefer the originals to the Vampire Diaries. Like,
I just feel like that's not my cup of tea. But I love True Blood. What We Do in the Shadows, love that. The film anyway. Didn't really give the TV show a try. That's more kind of a spoof though.
yeah,
Buffy. Can't not mention Buffy, can you? Like Spike.
yeah. Was just never really a massive fan on that.
No, it was kind of before, just before our time, I
Yeah,
think. What have I missed any? There'll be some. I'll come off this and I'll be like in the shower 2 days later and be like, oh, I can't believe I forgot.
some weird ones like Strain and that, isn't there? Where, like weird
Strain.
Strain.
Never heard of that.
Like the one where like, it's like the vampires are more like less vampires and more just creatures.
Do you remember that awful one with I want to say Matthew McConaughey, but I don't know if it is. Daybreak.
Oh, Daybreak, that's now.
Was that
Was that Ethan Hawke on
Ethan
it?
Hawke?
Ethan Hawke,
Yeah,
come
that
on, that was terrible. That
that was one of the worst films I've ever seen, along
I
with
think
Cloud
it was
Atlas.
atrocious.
So yeah, so it's a bit like witches. Vampires are so deeply rooted. I think the obsession. And not that I'm obsessed with vampires, but for me, the obsession I can imagine is it's glamorous. It's more of a glamorous monster. They're depicted as good looking, cool,
Super powerful, immortal.
immortal, clever, rich. You know what I mean?
Aye.
Because it would be pretty rubbish being a vampire if you just had to go to work every day. You only want to do it if you're
I'd imagine like
mortal
once you've got like
and
a few
rich.
hundred years under the belt, you've got to have some sort of money behind you.
Would you though? Because I mean, I feel like the older I get, the poorer I get. I don't agree with that one,
Well, because
unless
no,
you
because like they would
invest.
be, I was about to say they'd be able to invest in that, wouldn't they? Especially ones that have been living
Mm,
for a few hundred years. If you've lived in sort
true.
of like times where you could have invented something in that.
Or you just things that you've got at that old, you could
Yeah,
sell them
exactly.
maybe. So now we're going to look at Dracula himself because that's kind of vampires have been twisted in lots of different ways. But it all came really from the idea of the one man himself, Dracula. So it's interesting that what you mentioned there, but how Dracula looks and how you think he should look. So Bram Stoker is where we kick it off, really. So Bram Stoker's Dracula novel in 1897. It was inspired by Whitby, the scenery of Whitby.
Yeah,
You can imagine Victorian setting, and there's been lots of different depictions of this film, and the story itself has evolved, as you can imagine, over time. One of the closest depictions, though, is a 1992 film with Gary Oldman. So this is the closest to the original story that Jonathan Harker, I think, is Keanu Reeves, and Winona Ryder is Lucy. So that sticks quite to the Gothic Victorian story.
yeah.
But Gary Oldman, at the start he's this disgusting creature, and then he evolves into kind of more cool. Um,
He is an absolute like
Brilliant
chameleon,
actor.
Gary
Oh,
Oldman. Like,
great,
he can
isn't
just do
he?
anything.
Yeah, and then if we want to go way back to one of the first times we see Dracula, a vampire, is in a kind of film depiction is Nosferatu, which was in 1922. It's based loosely on Bram Stoker's novel, but he's a disgusting monster. He's vile. He's awful. And it's not until the 1930s when we see this creature who's vile. It evolves. It gets a Hollywood makeover. Basically, it gets a glow up. So in 1930, we see Bela Lugosi, who we remember from the Haunted Mirrors, some did Bloody Mary.
Yeah.
So he was an Eastern European actor. He takes over, and with from here on, we really tend to see Count Dracula in a certain. He's got black hair, slicked black hair, suave, handsome. He's very charming. You've got him in the tuxedo with a cape, you know. He's capable of seducing his victims. He's not only a monster, he's actually seduces these victims. And this theme's continued. If you think of Tom Cruise in Interview with a Vampire, Robert Pattinson in Twilight, um, this idea is so popular and entertaining and frightening because it plays on, I don't know, it's at that kind of young girls, I don't know, dream man in a way. Do you know what I'm trying to say there?
Dreamer, maybe
Yeah,
the
but you know what I
Robert
mean.
Pattinson one, I guess.
Yes, that's what I mean. It plays on that fantasy of, I suppose, that this man is not only a monster, but he can seduce you, I suppose. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
You know, I know what I mean.
Yeah, well, one of his main powers is supposed to be that he can sort of get people to do what he wants,
Well,
isn't it?
that's it. It's like control, isn't it? And it's like werewolf versus vampire is a big theme. Tends to be in lots of films. I wonder, where did this come from? When did they become linked?
Quite a few films sort of started putting them together, didn't they? The sort of like the two ones that would they're supposed both supposed to be like type of immortals. So it was like the Battle of
Hmm.
Immortal, wasn't it? Battle of
Oh,
Immortals.
I
So it was a little
see.
bit like
I don't think werewolves were
you'd
immortal
put like quite a
originally.
lot of them,
Hmm.
quite a lot of them are. But like I suppose you'd have like they're the two that can sort of like they're similar, aren't they? They can take each other on. Like
Hmm.
a vampire or a werewolf against a mummy wouldn't exactly be a brilliant fight, would it?
Mm.
Or a vampire and a werewolf again, like against a zombie. Yeah, I
Yeah.
mean, like,
Who
whereas
is?
vampires and werewolves share similar sorts of like powers. Obviously, one can transform into a werewolf, one can transform into a bat.
Yeah.
One
They're
like
both human
they're
in
both
essence.
humanish, yeah, and they
Yeah.
can
Uh-huh.
like sort of
Yeah, but there's
free
got to be
whatever, isn't it?
somewhere where they got linked because they didn't. It wasn't in Bram Stoker's novel, obviously. So.
Maybe something to research and put in the next
Maybe
one. I think.
something, yes. Anyway, let's dive in because we could get carried away with what came first, the vampire or the werewolf. So where did the concept of a human drinking another human's blood to survive come from? That's what I was quite interested when I first started looking into this. I thought, where would it have come from? So we're going to find out. So if you look up vampire folklore online, you'll see that the idea of drinking human blood has been perpetuated for millennia in a variety of cultures worldwide. However, today we'll focus on more modern post 1000 AD interpretations. So yeah, you could get bogged down and going all the way back and thinking of like satanic links and things and pagan things, but we're just going to focus on, I say modern, after 1000 AD. So I took this from the historychannel.com. So vampires are evil mythological beings who roam the world at night. They search for people whose blood they want to feed upon. They may best they may be the best known classic monster of all, and most people associate vampires with Count Dracula, the legendary blood-sucking subject of Bram Stoker's epic novel Dracula, which was published in 1897. But the history of vampires began long before Stoker was even born. There are almost as many different characteristics of vampires as there are vampire legends. But the main characteristic of the vampire is they drink human blood. They typically drain their victims' blood using their sharp fangs, killing them and turning them into vampires. In general, vampires hunt at night since sunlight weakens their powers. Some may have the ability to morph into a bat or a wolf. Ah, yeah, that's right. I remember reading this now when I was going through this.
It's a
Maybe
weird
this
one,
is
isn't
where
it?
it's come from.
Yeah.
Hmm. Vampires have super strength and they often have, which as you've just said, a hypnotic effect on their victims. They can't see their own image in a mirror and they cast no shadow. It's thought that Bram Stoker named Count Dracula after Vlad Dracul, also known as Vlad the Impaler. So you've heard of this guy, haven't you?
Yeah,
Yeah, so this is where they think he got his the inspiration for the character of Dracula from, which would make sense, the name.
no, because
Um,
he was a real person from like history, and he.
oh yeah, and also he was Eastern European, which is, you
Aye,
know, they have that accent.
was in
So
Transylvania, in
yeah. So Vlad the Trampaler,
it.
Vlad the Impaler. Vlad Dracul was born in Transylvania in Romania. He ruled oh here we go, Wallachia.
It's a great guess,
To
mate.
go with that one in Romania, on and off from 1456 to 1462, which was isn't that long of a span, and that's on and off.
Aye.
Hmm.
Maybe just a year every now. Maybe it was only the times when it was darker
Only at
outside.
night.
Yeah, only at night. Aye.
Some historians describe him as a just but yet brutally cruel ruler who valiantly fought off the Ottoman Empire. He earned his nickname because his favourite way to kill his enemies was
Didn't pit him with a wooden stake.
as he was eating. Yeah. So, according to legend, Vlad Dracul enjoyed dining amidst his dying victims and dipping his bread in their blood. So they said that his victims would be impaled on spikes, and it was a really obviously agonizing way to death, and he would just sit and watch, which I
Aye.
think's inspired a lot of like Game of Thrones and things like that, hasn't
Well,
it?
Dracula Untold with Luke Evans is probably close to this one, isn't it?
Oh, no, I've seen
Where
that
he,
one.
I'm sure I've maybe watched
Oh,
it
yes, I
before.
have
Don't
seen
know,
that.
because
Is
he
that with?
fights off the Ottoman Empire and stuff and that, didn't he?
Yes,
I'm
that's
sure that because
right.
he goes and like obviously
So,
ends up becoming an
oh
actual vampire
yes,
and
I
stuff
knew
from the.
I knew there was another film. That's what
Uh,
I meant. Oh,
it's a good film as
we
well,
have to
like that.
watch that. I like Luke Evans.
Yeah,
So, um, yeah, so sorry, he enjoyed dining amidst his dying victims and dipping his bread in their blood. Whether these gory tales are true is actually unknown, but many people believe that these stories sparked Stoker's imagination to create the infamous Count Dracula, who was also from Transylvania, sucked his victim's blood, and could be killed by driving a stake through his heart. But according to Dracula expert Elizabeth Miller, Stoker didn't base Count Dracula's life on Dracula at all. Nonetheless, the similarities between the two are intriguing. So she doesn't think he did. I would. God, it's
pretty
got to,
close, isn't
got
it?
to be. Come
Aye.
on. Vampire superstition thrived in the Middle Ages. So yeah, he didn't. Bram Stoker didn't invent the idea of a vampire, but Dracula as a person, I do think came from Vlad the Impaler. I
Yeah,
think he's conflated the two. But this idea of vampires has been around since the Middle Ages, especially as the plague decimated entire towns. So often it's linked to pestilence and disease.
yeah,
The disease often left behind bleeding mouth lesions on its victims, which to the uneducated was a pure sign of vampirism. It looked like they died because they'd been kind of drinking blood and were contaminated, maybe. I don't
yeah,
know. It wasn't uncommon for anyone with an unfamiliar physical or emotional illness to be labelled a vampire. Most researchers have pointed to a blood disorder that can cause severe blisters on skin and that's exposed to sunlight as a disease that may have been linked to the vampire legend. So, this blood disorder, when you go into the sun, can just make your skin blister really badly, and that's like, oh, you can't be in the sun.
yeah,
So that's where that came from. Some symptoms of this blood disorder can be temporarily relieved by ingesting blood, apparently. Other diseases blamed for promoting the vampire myth include rabies or goiter. Never heard of goiter, but rabies when you've been bit by a dog, which could have sparked off the idea of possession by getting infected by
yeah.
a bite.
Exactly, bye
And
bye.
you go crazy, don't you, when you've got rabies
Yeah,
and start biting other people. So there you go, there's the vampire myth. Um, I used to have a really bad fear of getting rabies just out of nowhere. I just thought like if you got I just thought you could get rabies just from any like the air, but obviously you get infected. And this thing sticks in my head. I remember my mum said if when you've got rabies, you're so frantic and you lose your mind that you're scared of water even. So I used to go and run the tap and just see if I scared of it.
my days.
Yeah, oh God, honestly, it's hard being me. My head's just like,
Oh dear.
it's rabies again. When a suspected vampire died, their bodies were often disinterred to search for signs of vampirism. So they'd bury these poor people and then end up digging up the bodies. In some cases, a stake was thrust through the corpse's heart to make sure that they stayed dead, and other accounts describe the decapitation and burning of the corpses of suspected vampires well into the 19th century. Although modern science has silenced the vampire fears of the past, people who call themselves vampires do exist. They're normal seeming people, beg the difference,
Yeah, man, I was gonna say.
who drink small amounts of blood in a perhaps misguided effort to stay healthy.
I hope that's not human blood.
Well, maybe their own, I don't know. Still not good. Communities of self-identified vampires can be found on the internet, of course they can, and in cities and towns around the world. To avoid rekindling vampire superstitions, most modern vampires keep to themselves and typically conduct their feeding rituals, which include drinking the blood of willing donors in private. Maybe this is how vampires get all the money when they donate
Maybe.
blood. That's insane. If you're going to donate blood, please give it to a hospital.
Ah, yeah, aye.
Not Rick the Vampire from like some vampires don't ingest human blood, but they claim to feed off the energy of others. Oh, I've heard of this. Oh, what's it called? An emotional vampire?
It's like life energy in it.
Yeah. Many state that if they don't feed regularly, they become agitated or depressed. Vampires became mainstream after Dracula was published. Since then, Count Dracula's legendary persona has given the topic of many books, films, and television shows their theme and main premise.
Yeah.
Given the fascination people have with all things horror, vampires, real or imagined, are likely to continue to inhabit the earth for years to come. So, do you believe in vampires?
Well, I mean, based off what you've just said, because there's people who walk around calling themselves vampires, who drink blood.
Yeah, there's some, and
Clearly, there's definitely people who drink blood out there now,
it's like
whether or not they're
cannibals.
immortal or not.
No, it's like cannibals, isn't it? You get these
Uh,
strange groups of people. I mean, no offense if you are a self-identifying vampire. It's 2023, so who
yeah, you do
knows? You
what
do
you want.
you.
You do you. As long as you're not going out there and stealing the blood
Yeah,
or
that's it.
killing people for it.
But very odd. So no, I don't believe in vampires as in the immortal magical type, but
Aye.
there are people who identify as them.
I'm curious whether these people can go inside people's houses unless they've been invited.
I don't think we get invited to people's houses often, right?
Knocking on the door. You can't come in.
I don't think they're leaving the house much, if I'm honest. This one, before we move on to one of our stories for today, I took this from the National Geographic. So this is a bit more of an dive into Vampire the Legend as well, because I was really interested with this. So before I went onto the stories, I wanted to dive in a bit more.
Mhm.
So often these legends of vampires arose from actually a misunderstanding of how bodies decompose. So I do like a scientific explanation behind it. As a corpse skin shrinks, its teeth and fingernails kind of appear to have grown longer. So, given that, the kind of like long nails and, what I mean,
Sharp, pointy teeth.
sharp teeth, yeah. And as internal organs break down, a dark purge fluid can leak out of the nose and mouth. People unfamiliar with this process, which would be lots of people even now, but especially in the past,
Hmm.
would interpret this fluid to be blood and suspect that the corpse had been drinking it from the living. So, bloody corpses weren't the only cause for suspicion. Before people understood how certain diseases were spread, they sometimes imagined vampires were behind the unseen forces, slowly ravaging their communities. The one constant in the evolution of vampire legend has been its close association with disease, writes Mark Colin Jenkins in his book Vampire Forensics. Trying to kill vampires or prevent them from feeding was a way for people to feel as though they had some kind of control over disease and plague. And because of this, vampire scares tended to coincide with outbreaks of the plague. In 2006, archaeologists unearthed a 16th century skull in Venice, Italy, that had been buried among plague victims with a brick in its mouth. The brick was likely a burial tactic to prevent strega, Italian vampires or witches, from leaving the grave to eat people. And not all vampires were thought to physically leave their grave. In northern Germany, the Nachzähler, or after devourers, stayed in the ground, chewing on their burial shrouds. Again, this belief likely has to do with purge fluid, which could cause the shroud to sag or tear, creating the illusion that a corpse had been chewing on it. These stationary ghouls were still thought to cause trouble above ground, and were also believed to be the most active during outbreaks of the plague. In the 1679 tract on the chewing dead, a Protestant theologian accused the Naxala of harming their surviving family members through occult processes. He wrote that people could stop them by exhuming the body and stuffing their mouths with soil, and maybe a stone or a coin for good measure. Without their ability to chew, the tracts claimed the corpse would die of starvation. And tales of vampires continued to flourish in southern and eastern European nations in the 17th and 18th centuries, to the chagrin of some leaders. By the mid 18th century, Pope Benedict, let's try this number, the
14th.
14th, declared that vampires were fallacious fictions of human fantasies, and the Habsburg ruler Maria Theresa, I think that was Marie Antoinette's mum, I think, condemned vampire beliefs as superstition and fraud. Still, anti vampire efforts continued, and perhaps more surprisingly of all, one of the last big vampire scares occurred in 19th century New England, 2 centuries after the infamous Salem witch trials. So, this warms us up to our first story, and we're heading to 19th century New England in America. So, what do you think it could be?
Scrolling down so I can't see it then. I don't know. Not sure.
Mercy Brown, have you heard of her?
I'm sure it's been on a
I'm
documentary that
sure
we've
we've watched, and
watched.
we definitely
Yeah,
have watched it because I remember we watched it and we're just like, it got more and more ridiculous as
yeah.
these things tend to. I can't remember.
Got to say just before we go on to the
Yeah,
story
cool.
that Nachzea make it sounds like something that would be on Grimm.
Well, Grimm uses all the German
Yeah,
language,
exactly.
yeah. Hmm.
Just sounds like one of the creatures that would be on there.
Definitely, probably is. I think doesn't Grimm. Well, obviously it's a lot really Germanic, isn't it, with the fairy tales? I think.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, I think
They
that's
go to
another
Germany and
one.
that as well, don't
We should do
they?
a
That first.
supernatural slash Grimm. I love Grimm.
Oh, I do love Grimm.
So Mercy Brown, let's hear about her. So in 1992 was the year we were born.
Yeah, correct.
In 80, well done. In 1892, tuberculosis was the leading cause of death in the US. It was then known as consumption. Its symptoms include fatigue, night sweats, and the coughing up of white phlegm or even foamy blood. It was a really bad, not a good thing to get.
Yeah,
Sadly, there was no cure for TB. Physicians often recommended that a patient affected by the disease should rest, eat well, and exercise outdoors. Of course, these home remedies were really successful, and people with active TB actually had an 80% chance of dying from the illness. Set against a backdrop of fear, disease, and misery, residents of a small town in Rhode Island believed that they had a vampire on their hands, and her name was Mercy Brown. They believed that Mercy was spreading the deadly disease consumption, even though she died from the illness months earlier. It all started when a farmer named George Brown lost his wife, Mary Eliza, to TB in 1884. 2 years after the death of his wife, his oldest daughter died of the same illness. Before long, tragedy would strike the Brown family again. As the family members died one by one, people began to suspect that the reason was something far more sinister than a disease. Thankfully, the remaining members of George Brown's family appeared to be healthy until his son, Edwin, became seriously ill in 1891. He retreated to Colorado Springs in the hopes that he would recover in the better climate. However, he returned to Exeter in 1892 in an even worse state. Soon after, Edward's sister, Mercy Lena Brown, died from TB when she was only 19 years old, adding to the family's tragedy. Several concerned townspeople kept telling George Brown about an old folk tale. The superstition claims that, by some unexplained and unreasonable way, in some part of the diseased relative's body, live flesh and blood might be found, which is supposed to feed on the living who are in feeble health. So ultimately, the legend states that when members of the same family die from consumption, it might be because one of the deceased members of their family is draining the life force from their living relatives. So if your family members died of this disease, they'll come back and get the rest of their family and take them with them. It was the belief. So as a local newspaper reported, Mr. Brown did not place much credence in the old time theory, and he resisted their importunities until Wednesday, when the body of his wife and two daughters were exhumed, and an examination under the direction of Harold Metcalfe, MD of Wickford. Indeed, on the morning of March 17, 1892, a doctor and some locals exhumed the bodies of each family member who had died from TB. They found skeletons in the graves of Brown's wife and his eldest daughter. However, the doctor found that the 9-week-old remains of Mercy Brown looked surprisingly normal and undecayed. Furthermore, blood was found in Mercy Brown's heart and liver. This seemed to confirm the local fears that Mercy Brown was some kind of vampire who had been sucking the life from her living relatives. What happened to Mercy Brown after her death? The doctor tried to explain to the townspeople that Mercy Brown's preserved state was not unusual. After all, she'd been buried during the cold winter months. Nevertheless, superstitious locals insisted on removing both her heart and liver, and they burnt them before reburying her. The ashes were then mixed with water and fed to Edwin. Yes.
What? Absolutely mental.
Some people get chicken soup.
I just didn't tell him.
Yeah.
It's fair. Be good for you.
Cinnamon. Yeah, it's very like bizarre, isn't it?
Ah, it's very, very odd.
And they said that it's because she had blood in her liver, which I would presume maybe the blood drains away. I don't know. But because she was buried in the winter, she was in a more
I
preserved
was gonna say,
state.
should have been cold. It would just be
Yeah,
like
it's
being
only
in a
nine
fridge,
weeks, wasn't
wouldn't it?
it? Yeah. So in the ground, I
A
think
freezer.
I'm sure where they buried her, like, had some kind of like some ground has nutrients in and things. Um, So, unfortunately, this supernatural concoction it did not cure, as people had hoped. Edwin died a mere 2 months later. And such practices of digging up and burning the deceased over fears of vampire like creatures were not uncommon in many Western countries until the early 20th century. But while the Mercy Brown case was far from an isolated incident, her exhumation came at the end of an era for these vampire inspired rituals. While Mercy Brown had a very short life, we can assume her legacy as the last New England vampire will live on forever thanks to stories passed down over the years. Her surviving relatives reportedly saved local newspaper clippings and family scrapbooks, and they often discuss the story on Decoration Day when the town's residents decorated local cemeteries. That's very linked to kind of um, South American culture, isn't it? Like Day of the Dead and things.
Yeah.
Today, Mercy Brown's gravesite is so popular with sightseers and curious visitors that they often leave gifts behind, such as jewellery and plastic vampire teeth. Once there was even a note that read, "You go, girl."
Oh my
In what
God.
way? Like, you
You
go and
know.
kill all your
You
family?
go, girls. Suck the life from all your family
Keep
members.
slaying. I don't care. Signed, Edward Cullen. Um,
Glitter in the sun.
yeah. He sparkles. Clearly, none of that was happening during the vampire scare of the late 19th century. So, even though German scientist Robert Koch had discovered the bacteria that caused TB in 1888, germ theory only began to take a hold a decade later as the contagion was better understood. So, infection rates began to go down as hygiene and nutrition improved. And until then, people resorted to pointing fingers at alleged vampires like Mercy Brown, even when they were no longer alive to defend themselves. So as kind of science went up and disease went down, sorry, superstitions faded away
Well, yeah,
and
I just
religious
things
beliefs kind
things
of
could
as
get
well,
proved, couldn't they?
or disproved, yeah.
Uh,
So believability, was Mercy Brown
no.
a vampire?
Well, no, like she didn't even like. It's not even like they're trying to say that she got up from the grave and went and sucked on the blood or anything. They're trying to say that she's literally done
Yeah.
it from the grave and
No,
sucked it
no, they
through.
they think that they thought she was getting up at night and somehow reburying herself.
That's even worse. It's even worse.
Yeah,
How?
I know.
Digging our way out and then oh, better get back in the grave and cover myself up.
Yeah, unless I had an accomplice, I don't know. From the blame the devil, wouldn't they? The devil did it.
Ridiculous.
So that was our first. We've only got two stories because it's we've told quite a bit about the history and backstory. So that was kind of going back in times like the 1800s, early 1900s.
Yeah,
So now we've got one more story that really fascinates me, and it's kind of a vampire story meets an urban legend in America. And have you heard of Black-Eyed Kids?
I haven't
No, not
heard of the black eyed
confused with
peas.
Black-Eyed Peas. Yeah, so no, there's no Fergie in this one. So Black Eyed Kids, it's really fascinating and it kind of really creeps me out, this one. So Black Eyed Children or Black Eyed Kids, as they're sometimes known, in American legend, are paranormal creatures that resemble children aged between 6 and 16. They've got pale skin and black eyes, and they are reportedly seen hitchhiking or begging or are encountered on doorsteps of residential homes. So they kind of just spring up. It's very much linked to kind of the idea of like the Lost Boys and things like that, where there's these group of kind of what's that? That's it. That sorry, it's just come back. Salem's Lot, based on Stephen King novel. Have you read
Oh
Salem's
yeah.
Lot? It's like it's an old one from the 60s or 70s. That's really creepy. Where there's these kind of it's like creepy kind of kids and stuff.
Uh,
Oh, am I getting mixed? Is it Salem's Lot? Which one's the one where the kids, the Simpsons do it, where they're all kind of blonde kids? The
eh,
Simpsons do it. I'm sure it's
was
Salem's
that not like
Lot.
that one? Like,
It's not
like
Children of the
I was gonna
Corn.
say,
I think it's Salem's Lot, but if I'm wrong, I'm wrong.
well, obviously.
Yeah, I'm gonna Google it right now. So we just had to pause there. I couldn't find it on Google. I did have to ring my mum. It's Village of the Damned, where these kids are like really unsettling, creepy. There was also, she said, a program Midwich Cuckoos, which is where the kids are just like possessed and evil. But yes, with this kind of scary idea that kids are, it flips on its head a little bit when kids are the enemy in the back. It's really unsettling. So yeah, so here we go. We're going to hear a story. I took this one from Ranker, and there's a couple of different stories I got on there. So, creepy stories about black-eyed kids have several things in common. First, it seems to take a while for people to notice the children's eyes. You would think that would be the first thing you see, but somehow the children seem to be able to temporarily shield their eye colour even from those looking directly at them. Another common theme is the instant feeling of unease and dread that people experience the moment they get close to one of these creepy children. They don't need to see their eyes to know that there's something wrong with them. The mind may not be able to immediately process what exactly is going on with the black eyed children, but in most of these stories, survival instincts kick in pretty quickly. For many of these witnesses, it's a primal, full body experience of terror. So, are you ready for the first story?
Yeah.
One of the earliest recorded sightings of black eyed children was back in 1950. A 16-year-old named Harold was strolling up his street to his nearby Virginia home when he noticed a boy leaning on a nearby fence. Harold said hello, but he received no response. He turned to leave, then the mysterious boy finally spoke. I want to go to your house. You're going to walk me up to your house. That was when Harold noticed the boy's eyes. They were pitch black. All of his instincts screamed, run, yet he just stood there. Then, as if reading Harold's mind, the boy said, now, don't you run away from me. You're going to walk me up to your house. That was enough to spring Harold into action. He booked it out of there. He claimed he heard the child let out a scream of a bobcat, but he wasn't willing to turn around to be sure. The account goes on to reveal that Harold's parents actually believed this tale, and his father went out with a gun in his hand, looking for what they believed was a devil. The black-eyed child was gone, but Harold's mother demanded he go to the local priest to be safe. Thoughts?
I mean, if a creepy little kid said that to you, he's like, no. Like,
Yeah.
certainly not, like, be running straight away. He made the right choice to start with, and, like, fair enough.
I love how like usually in these stories they get in and the parents are like, "Oh, don't be silly, you're just imagining
Uh,
things." Dad was like, "Get the rifle,
Maybe
assault
he'd seen one
rifle."
before.
Yeah. It kind of reminds me a little bit of that film that's really good, Let Me In, which is I think it's originally a Swedish or I think Swedish, could be wrong. Originally a Swedish film, but it got made into a British version or American
Was that
version.
that one with a kid?
Like it's a little girl who's a vampire and she befriends
Aye.
the boy. But that's the idea, isn't it? That, like you said, they can control your mind, but they can't just come in. They've got to have permission.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting, that one. I wonder where that comes from. Having them, it's like a religious thing, like sacred ground. I don't know.
Um, it's just like they're just not allowed to enter your home, are
So the second story. A gas station attendant in northeast Louisiana had a terrifying encounter in November 2012. So this one's quite recent. The gas station was creepy enough to begin with at three in the morning, but then when the power went out, it got even worse. Led by the light of his cell phone, the attendant was able to get one of the generators going, but the backup lighting was dim and only lit up in certain areas, like the cash area and the parking lot, while the rest of the isolated establishment was cloaked in black. Out in that darkness, he noticed movement. Three children on bikes were heading his way. They stood at the door and stared at the attendant, and he felt creeped out. But they were just kids, and it was way too late for them to be out. He opened the door and asked if they were okay. The young girl asked to use a phone, but he handed his cell over to but as he handed his cell over to her, he realized that her eyes were all black. No, I need a real one. She pointed up at the landline inside. The thought of letting her inside sent chills up his spine. He shouted at all of them to leave as he slammed and locked the door. The children stood there a bit longer, silently staring at him through the glass with their solid black eyes. Then they got back on their bikes and disappeared back into the darkness. The next morning, the attendant was eager to go through the surveillance footage. Unfortunately, the power outage had cut the cameras off, and they didn't book back up.
they? Boot back up with the generator.
They didn't boot back up with the generator. That was like a tongue twister. Thanks. He had nothing to prove the events of the night before had even took place. So
Imagine if
thoughts.
those kids were just like wanting to use a phone, get the parent to come pick them up for me, he's like, get away.
Harold's dad comes from the rear with his gun.
Yeah, there they are. Let's get him, Harold. No,
Um,
fair enough though. I wouldn't be letting them in like
no, not if you saw that the eyes were pure. I mean, like, no one's
black
got pure
guy.
black. It's like a sign of a demon, isn't it? Pure black
Aye.
eyes without an iris.
I mean,
No,
especially if
come
they wanted
on.
to come in, they wouldn't use the mobile. Right, nah.
Yeah, they, uh-huh. that that kids nowadays wouldn't even know what a landline is.
Yeah,
The
aye,
first
that's the
like
first sign now. Yeah, I couldn't get
yeah.
away with that anymore.
No. But it's really interesting because these are the only two stories I've got on it. But if you Google black-eyed kids or black-eyed children, there's loads of stories, and yeah, they probably are a bit dubious, like Reddit kind of threads. But they're really interesting. There's lots of them from different sources. And another one that I've read that I haven't put in there is basically this guy was sitting in his car in an empty parking lot, and one of these kids appears at the door, the window, and he's like, "Can you let me in? I need to get home. I need a ride. Can you give me a ride?" And then all of a sudden, he's kind of surrounded by this gang of black-eyed kids, and they're all very. It's that sense of, and you hear this a lot when people say they've had experiences with paranormal or even time slips. It's this kind of sense of evil and dread that washes over him, and he just locked his doors. And then the next day, because he was from out of town or something, he was telling the locals, and they were saying, "Oh yeah, okay, we don't go out after dark because there's a troop of black-eyed kids who we don't know where they come from, what the origin is, but they're very dangerous, and no one's kind of lived to tell the tale." So they get linked, I think, to vampires because of the idea of they're eternally young. They're like they're immortal.
And they need your permission to come in.
Yeah. Um, pale skin, only out at night. I think that's why they get linked to vampires. But there could be. I've written down here. Well, actually, there could be ghosts. There could be aliens, demons,
Yeah. Children of the Corn,
just kids who are.
messing around.
What about if you take drugs? Does that not it makes your eyes go a bit? The pupils really
Considering some of these
dilate.
kids are 6 year old.
Yeah, but some of them are like most of the stories are like 14-year-olds, 16-year-olds. It could not be that they've been messing around with substance abuse and the eyes are crazy and that's why they're acting really off and out
Yeah,
at night. That sounds more likely to
could be,
me.
yeah.
But anyway, I thought it was really interesting. And so, what do you think these kids could be if we're all going to buy into the fact that they're some kind of creature, like Lost Boys, or a
Um,
troop of kind of orphaned vampires?
yeah, it's a weird one, I don't know.
Yeah,
It's
because
not
if
to
you
say
if
it
you turn
really.
into a vampire and you're a kid, it's rubbish really because you're just a kid forever. Oh, is that good? I don't know.
Yeah.
Not so good.
Well, I don't know, based off Twilight, who do it, you'd have to go to school over and over again, so probably not a good.
I think
Not,
they're like
not that good,
35
alright.
though. I don't know how they're getting
Makes no sense.
So thoughts, let's sum it up then. We've had the American version. In the new year, we're going to have the British version. I've got some good stories as well for that one. So thoughts on vampires so far? Have I convinced you that they exist?
I mean, based off the ones who actually drink blood and stuff, I suppose, but
Hmm.
ones who are actually immortal and that, I don't know, the jury's still out on it.
And lastly, um, who would win in a fight between, let me think, Edward Cullen and
Whoever else are you gonna say?
and Blade?
Blade. What? What? You at least make it a fair fight. Poor Edward. They
Oh,
do him in. It's his speciality.
poor Edward. So thank you so much for listening to this episode of Ghosts, Creatures and Scares. Oh my. If you'd like to stay updated, please do give us a follow on Instagram.
Next time, we'll be exploring the twisted but absolutely fascinating story of the Winchester Mystery House. See you soon. Hello, and welcome to episode 20 of Ghosts, Creatures, and Scares Oh My. This episode is called Bloodthirsty Vampires, the American edition.